This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 558 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So I start off this show each week with a recap of last week, as you guys know. After week 1, it wasn't great. Week 2 was a little bit better, but still not the best. And then week 3 was fine. Week 4, though, if I could duplicate week 4's results over and over and over again, I'd be a very, very happy man. Last week, I talked up Sam Darnold. He was the QB2 in weekly scoring. I talked up Taylor Heineke. He was the QB5. I continued to be into Emmanuel Sanders and Dawson Knox. Sanders scored 13 PPR points. Knox was the tight end 2. Kenneth Gainwell was a top 10 running back. Dalton Schultz was a top 5 tight end. AJ Green was a top 20 wide receiver. Van freaking Jefferson was a top 10 play. Even Kadarius Toney wasn't a bad play with 6 catches for 78 yards. And the fades were good too. I was fading the Raiders' passing attack, and Derek Carr had by far his worst performance of the season. I was fading Damian Harris, and he didn't do much at all. I was fading Tyson Williams, and he wasn't even active. There were a few misses like Terrace Marshall and Jalen Reagor. But considering the players I'm talking about on this show, I'll take those results all day long. I won't expect those results each week, but man, it was fun to see those results in week 4. Let's hope that it can continue. Before getting into the picks that will almost certainly be worse this week, I want to remind you guys about the FanDuel NFL High-Low, which is a free-to-play fantasy football contest. All you have to do is build your scorecard with the teams that you think will score highest or lowest in 4 stat categories. The closer you are to being spot on, the more points you'll get. Players with the most points each week split the prize pool, and a perfect scorecard will win the jackpot. Head over to FanDuel.com today and play the FanDuel High-Low for free. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. I like Sam Darnold yet again this week within this first tier of players who are rostered in 25 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. I mentioned on yesterday's 10 Trend show that while his rushing touchdowns are bound to regress, his passing touchdowns are going to rebound. He's going to do better through the air. In other words, it's not like he's doing what he's doing in fantasy football strictly because of his rushing touchdowns. They're helping, but they're also resulting in a below average number in the passing touchdown category. Carolina has 11 offensive scores this year. That's above average. But their passing touchdown number of 5 is below average. As those rushing touchdowns regress, the passing touchdowns will get better if we assume the offense performs the same way. Darnold gets Philadelphia this week in a game where the Panthers have a reasonable 24-point team total, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. He should be fine as a streamer. And the same goes for Daniel Jones. I feel like people are a little bit more down on Daniel Jones after that week 3 game where he was the chalk, and he didn't come through with this monster performance against the Falcons. But he's now scored 21 or more fantasy points in 3 of 4 games. And he's coming off a contest without 2 of his starting wide receivers where he threw for over 400 yards. The Giants get Dallas this week, and they're going to have to keep pace with that Cowboys offense. Dallas has been a middle-of-the-road team in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and this game between the Giants and Cowboys is one of the higher over-unders on this Week 5 slate. So Jones is a strong option. Now, moving away from quarterbacks, let's look at Michael Carter at running back in this tier. I haven't talked about Michael Carter that much on the show this year because the Jets' offense has been so bad. But against Atlanta, maybe we see a little bit more life to this unit, especially after last week's performance against Tennessee. The Jets have an implied team total close to 22 points this week. That's not bad for the Jets. And Carter has led the Jets over the last 2 weeks with a 70% running back rush share per game to go along with about a 9% target share. Those are good numbers, but he hasn't produced anything spectacular because, again, he's in the Jets' offense. So maybe this matchup against Atlanta will help them get going. The Falcons currently rank in the bottom 10 in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks, wide receivers, and running backs. Carter has sneaky flex appeal this week. I don't mind Devontae Parker this week either. He's not someone I typically target or care for, but Miami gets Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is the team that's allowing the most adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers this year. But more importantly than the matchup, Parker's been seeing volume in this Miami offense. He's had at least a 21% target share in 3 of 4 games played this year, and his total target share on the season is over 22%. With a negative game script likely coming, and with the Tampa Bay defense doing so well against the run, Miami's going to be forced to throw a lot. With the last player in this tier, I was going to talk about Hunter Renfrow, but I'm going to go with Darnell Mooney. Mooney now has a 26% target share on the season, and the Bears named Justin Fields the starter on Wednesday. That's good news for Mooney's deep threat ability. In last week's game, Fields threw it 15 or more air yards on over 35% of his throws. He connected on 5 of those 6 passes. If the Bears aren't able to play with a lead against the Raiders, they'll be forced to air it out more than they typically do. That might mean more scrambles for Fields. That would be great. But it also means more volume for the pass catchers, and that's been a problem all season long. Let's move on to the 10 to 25% rostered tier and start with Zach Pascal. Pascal started the season hot with unsustainable touchdown production, but he's seen at least 5 targets in every game this year and has about a 17% target share. That's not like super special given the Colts offense isn't great, but he's still involved. He's also played the second most snaps at wide receiver for Indy by a pretty wide margin. Now the Colts get the Ravens this week, and they're 7-point underdogs. That means that we're probably going to see somewhat of a pass-heavy script for them. And Pascal, who's played more snaps from the slot than any other player in football this year, has a somewhat advantageous matchup. Baltimore's been the 3rd best team in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers this year, but they rank 1st in slot yards allowed, 2nd in slot receptions allowed, and 3rd in percentage of targets that go to the slot. So Pascal's kind of a sneaky play this week. Another wide receiver in this tier that you could look to is KJ Osborne. Like Pascal, Osborne had a hot start to the season, but he's cooled down over the last 2 weeks with 2 sub-7 PPR point performances. But he's seen at least 18% of Minnesota's targets in 3 of 4 games this year. And he gets Detroit this week, a team that's beatable through the air. I think volume is somewhat of a concern here because Minnesota could just see a positive game script throughout this contest, but he's still an interesting option. You could go back to Van Jefferson this week as well. I hate to bring up the same names on this show like I was doing with Kenneth Gainwell week in and week out, but as I mentioned on the 15 Transaction show this week, the peripherals are generally there for Van. He's been playing a similar number of snaps as Robert Woods and running a similar number of routes. His target share just isn't super high because of number 1, the offense he's in, but number 2, he's still inexperienced and not the best wide receiver in the world. Targets are commanded by good players. Van is fine, he's a great route runner, but he's still not on Robert Woods' level. That doesn't mean he's a bad sleeper. The Rams could be involved in a high-scoring game on Thursday night, and once again, Jefferson is a cheap way to get exposure to that contest. The last player in this tier that I want to shout out is Zach Ertz. Ertz has seen more volume than Dallas Goedert this season while running a similar number of routes. It's not easy to just find tight ends off the waiver wire who have a role, and Zach Ertz has a role. He has a 14% target share this year, and he has back-to-back weeks where he's seen at least 18% of Philadelphia's targets. Carolina is an above-average matchup when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, and Philly could face another negative game script, which should force more passing, so Zach Ertz can work. It's time to dig deep. With this tier, we're talking players that no one cares about in fantasy football. Khalif Raymond has target shares of 36% and 16% over his last 2 games. He's played 75% of Detroit's snaps in both of these contests. This week, he's facing a Minnesota secondary that's been beatable this year. Before last week's game against Cleveland, where Baker Mayfield played like hot trash, they'd given up a top 15 performance in all 3 games and 2 additional top 30 performances. They faced some good wide receivers, but they're still an average team in fantasy points allowed to the position. If the script is negative for Detroit, which it's projected to be, they could throw a lot, which is what we've seen outside of neutral game scripts from the Lions this year. Deontay Harris has seen a 15% target share and a 33% target share over his last 2 games. The Saints are averaging the fewest targets per game as a team, so their skill position players need high target shares in order to see meaningful volume through the air. But a 33% share will do it. That yielded 8 targets against the Giants. This week, New Orleans faces Washington. The football team, despite running the second most plays this season while trailing, they faced a slightly above average pass rate defensively. Because the secondary has not been good, teams are attacking that secondary. No team has been better for opposing quarterbacks in adjusted points allowed, and only 3 teams have been better for wide receivers than the football team. There's a chance that we see maybe a little bit more volume from New Orleans this week because of the matchup. I would expect Jameis Winston to try to take advantage. Now, I can't imagine that you're in a 12-team league and you need to start Harris. But in deeper formats, he should be on your radar. And then lastly, I'm going to go back to Kadarius Toney. He saw a quarter of the Giants' targets last week, and there's still a chance that we don't see Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton this week. If Shepard in particular is out, I would expect Toney to have a full-time slot role in this offense. Dallas has been average against the slot so far this year, but we could see New York with a negative game script in this one, which would lead to more Daniel Jones passes. Now, I doubt Toney reaches another 25% target share, but this is the right kind of game environment to target. Also, watch the injury reports for A.J. Brown and Julio Jones. The Titans wide receivers are in a great spot against Jacksonville this week, so you could get waiver wire juice from Nick Westbrook-Akine or Josh Reynolds. They both played similar snaps last week, and they both had similar target shares. Now we get into a handful of players rostered in a lot of leagues who I think are scary starts in Week 5. Odell Beckham is one of them. I mentioned on the 15 Transactions episode that I love his peripherals, and I do. He's been utilized exactly how you'd want him to be utilized since he's come back from his injury. He just has a tough task against the Chargers this week. Listen to this. LA right now, they rank best in adjusted quarterback points allowed and best in adjusted wide receiver points allowed. They're even 6th best against tight ends. I understand if you can't bench OBJ, but at least temper expectations. I feel similarly about JuJu Smith-Schuster. We'll see what the status of Chase Claypool is this weekend, but Juju's got just a 16% target share so far this year, and he's given you just one PPR performance better than wide receiver 64. I know that some of this is on Ben Roethlisberger. Juju could have actually had a nice game against Green Bay had Ben not missed a couple of throws. But they get Denver this week. It's a secondary that's been above average against wide receivers this year, and one that has been really, really good against slot guys. Juju's played over 76% of his snaps from the slot this year, and Denver is one of just a handful of teams that hasn't allowed a slot touchdown. They also rank 4th best in the league in slot receptions allowed and best in the league in slot yards allowed. Now, in that same game on the other side is Melvin Gordon. Pittsburgh's defense hasn't been strong this year, or as strong as it was last year, but they've been good at stopping opposing running backs. Only 3 teams have been better in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Melvin Gordon is splitting his backfield up completely with Javonte Williams. So we've got a scenario where in a good matchup, you can get away with using Melvin Gordon. In a bad matchup where the backfield's not likely going to score a lot of points, it's a tougher thing to do. And then the other running back that you could consider benching is Miles Sanders. I talked about him on the 10 Trends show and how the Eagles' use of Kenneth Gainwell, it's just torpedoing Sanders' value. Because Philadelphia is often in negative game scripts. Well, this weekend they're in Charlotte and they're underdogs. If a negative game script hits, that's bad news. But Carolina's also been really good against running backs this season. They've allowed the 5th fewest points in the position, but they actually rank 1st when you adjust that for schedule. Why? Because they faced Dallas and New Orleans, and they really held the Saints. Zeke was good against them last weekend, but the Cowboys actually had fewer points scored against the Panthers as a running back unit versus what they've seen per game this year. So Miles Sanders is tough to trust. And very quickly, let's talk defensive streamers. I mentioned Minnesota earlier this week, and they're in play. I also don't mind Arizona against San Francisco. The thing is, those 2 defenses are now rostered in more leagues after waivers have run. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's go with Vegas. The Raiders are 5.5 point favorites against the Bears in a game with a 44.5 point over-under. They're likely a fairly safe option considering Chicago scored just 6 offensive touchdowns this year. That's the 2nd fewest in football. Chicago's also the 3rd best matchup for opposing defenses when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the Mailbag Show.